Hi, I'm Glenn Howard. I'm the president of the Jamestown Foundation, and we're delighted to have again for another one of our biweekly flyover series with Brigadier General Robert Spalding. Uh, General Spalding is a board member of the Jamestown Foundation, is also a senior fellow at the Hudson Institute, and we've started these biweekly flyovers as an effort to try to tap into his knowledge about what's going on with China and touch some of the common and very hot issues related to U.S.-China relations. General Spalding, thank you for joining us today. I wanted to talk to you about the recent developments in the United States with TikTok. That's been in a lot of headlines. I think the United States is trying to make an effort by the Trump administration to try to block TikTok, try to get it banned inside the United States. What are your current thoughts about how that's operating, and what are the prospects for? This is a very popular app in the United States. Many American youth use it, very common, and it seems like it's going to have a very difficult challenge ahead of us to try to get it banned.
Well, I think TikTok's really a data vacuum. It's owned by a Chinese company. It's really, I think, one of the new, battlefields of war in the 21st century that, quite frankly, the United States has been lax about picking up on. If you go back to the invention of nuclear weapons, we had this enormous Manhattan Project, and we really, dominated that field in many ways still do. And on the case of internet technology, we developed it, but it was really developed in the private sector, after, the creation of ARPANET. But the authoritarian regimes of the world, primarily Russia and China, really adopted those and then incorporated it into the way that they thought about warfare. And so this idea of political warfare that the Chinese and both the Russians practice is really amplified in the globalized internet connector world. TikTok's really, one of the great weapons, if you will, in China's arsenal, because it's a data vacuum. What they seek to do with that data is both coerce and influence and collect intelligence. And so that's what they're doing with it. This is also consistent with their strategy with regard to 5G. So we talk a lot about Huawei, but it's really not about Huawei. It's about China's tech companies, Baidu, Alibaba, and Tencent. They are the equivalent to, in the case of Baidu, Google; in the case of Alibaba, Amazon; in the case of Tencent, Facebook. So what they seek to do is take the power of those companies and then build them into the smart cities around the world. And whether it's in Europe or the United States or in Asia, they want to be collecting data. Now, TikTok's a feature of our current smartphone world, but really as they move into the smart city, this data they collect will be fed to their companies that will ensure their economic dominance, but also their social and political dominance as well, is because they use these social media platforms and e-commerce platforms and artificially intelligence powered cameras that do facial recognition to really collect data and then turn around and use that data to influence. And so banning of TikTok's absolutely necessary. Now, they just announced that Oracle was in talks to buy it. Oracle owning TikTok does not take away the danger, because the truth of the matter is that TikTok and all other applications, social media applications, are built on this open data model, and China can get that data if they want it. And so if TikTok's not going to be reformed in terms of being this huge data vacuum, not just a social media platform, but a data vacuum, because they collect so much data about the individual, then it's still a problem even in the hands of Oracle. The bigger ban that I think is really going to be a game changer is WeChat. WeChat doesn't have any competitors in China. And so all Chinese practically are on WeChat and spend most of their time on WeChat, over 1 billion users. What WeChat allows the Chinese to do, because other social media from outside is banned in China, all Chinese get on WeChat and they stay on WeChat. And therefore, when they leave the Great Firewall, when they would be available to have other viewpoints, to have other social media platforms, they tend to stay on WeChat. So essentially that platform, because it's so useful for Chinese language speakers, really becomes a way for the Chinese government to extend the firewall globally. So they are censoring and controlling the thoughts and in conversations of Chinese language speakers in America and other democracies. And so banning WeChat and ensuring that they can't bring it out of the Great Firewall ensures that, when these Chinese people come to the United States, they're going to have to get other applications that are designed with more of with less of a Chinese censorship in mind.
So that would allow the Chinese and or allow the United States, with its influence, to force these students to use these other types of platforms aside from WeChat, and then that allows us to kind of expand our ability to reach in and prevent Chinese propaganda from reaching them. Is that
Right?
Now there was also, I wanted to mention, in President Trump's executive order that he signed, he put it was also WeChat and he was also TikTok, and I wanted to ask about, in the WeChat there was a description that WeChat recently, through Tencent, hired a DC lobbyist, which could it seems to be an effort by the Chinese to try to influence U.S. Congress and policymakers on the issue of trying to ban WeChat. Now, what is Tencent's role within this, and how important is this development when they're trying to hire a DC lobbyist to advocate on their behalf?
Well, I mean, Tencent, like the other big tech companies I mentioned, they're really about data. So they're large data companies that use big data analysis, machine learning, artificial intelligence to take that data and turn it to actionable information to influence consumers' behavior and also to influence your political orientation. TikTok's kind of the tool to get the data, and then the real power behind that is Tencent. And so all of these, artificial intelligence research centers that, Amazon and Facebook and Google have in China are usually in collaboration with a company like Tencent. So Tencent is really going to be a dominant AI company. And if you look at, or if you listen to Kai-Fu Lee, who's China's, artificial intelligence thought leader, he says their goal is to become the Saudi Arabia of data. And so that power of artificial intelligence is going to be in companies like Tencent as they use that for economic dominance, but also, as I said, social and political dominance as well.
I wanted to ask you about, you're clearly watching what's going on in Hong Kong. It seems like we are in U.S.-China relations and in the West in general, efforts to block China in Hong Kong. I mean, are we really limited now in our policy options and what we can do to prevent the Chinese from cracking down further in Hong Kong, or is this, where do you think this is headed?
Well, the most important policy option that we haven't actually executed, and that really gives the Chinese Communist Party their incredible advantage, is the fact that the Hong Kong Monetary Authority is still allowed to exchange Hong Kong dollars for US dollars. In effect, China now has two currencies that they can manipulate and control. Before they were doing it, but now it's clear that we've announced that Hong Kong is no longer sufficiently autonomous, which means that it's no different in policy respects from the mainland. And what the Chinese Communist Party does is use Hong Kong dollars to draw in US dollars into the mainland, which they exchange in for renminbi, the People's Bank of China does, and then they keep the money for whatever uses that they want. So it is essentially a money, it's used as the lure for a Chinese money trap. And this is what drives the Chinese economy. It's our capital. It's our institutional investors, which are really, retirement funds. And it's our university endowments, which are in the tens of billions of dollars. So, the interesting thing about the United States that I think people don't realize is, as a nation, we have 40% of the world's investable capital. And what we've allowed to have happen over the last 20 years is for the Chinese Communist Party to have control over the flow of that money. And they've used Hong Kong as that lure to do it. And we are continuing to allow them to do that. And so I think, from the Treasury's perspective, they need to implement, a ban on transfer of the Hong Kong dollar for the US dollar, because in effect, China has two currencies.
And what's preventing Treasury from doing that? I mean, from a Trump administration perspective?
Wall Street.
So it's basically Wall Street preventing them from doing that then?
Yeah, there is a concern by Wall Street that their inability to invest in China will be impacted by the fact that they can't get American depository receipts in Hong Kong. So if you look at China today, this year, their stock market has gone up tremendously in spite of the coronavirus, in spite of all the sanctions and tariffs. And there's been billions of dollars of new Chinese companies doing IPOs in Hong Kong. That money is racing into China to help build weapons, to help build a Belt and Road Initiative, to help build their economy. And it's not racing into US communities to help build our own. It's not racing into our own economy to help stabilize it. So, this is, when you're talking about the financial system and the economic system and its role in national security, what we've had really since the end of the Cold War and globalization is a tendency to inject money into the financial system. That money has gone into our banking system, and then those banks have turned around and lent that money to the Chinese Communist Party, mostly private businesses. And as you know, since there's no audit or transparency requirements in those businesses, that money's effectively gone, trillions of dollars. And in kind of like the old adage, the first thing you do when you find yourself at the bottom of a hole is to stop digging. Many of these investment banks are concerned that if we cut off the exchange, that their money is going to be trapped in China. Here's the note for them. It's gone. The money's trapped. You're not getting it out. The Chinese Communist Party is just trying to see how much more you'll put in before it's cut off.
Huh. Well, that's a very fascinating point, because it's kind of that's a general strategic problem with the way that China uses these markets as a way to raise capital and then transfer that capital back into China. And I wanted to ask, there was a testimony by Keith Crack. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing the name correctly, but he's the Undersecretary of State for Economic Growth and Energy and the Environment. And he was testifying recently before Congress, was talking about, he was urging U.S. universities to disclose Chinese stocks that are held in index funds. And he said that studies have shown that the majority of the U.S. university endowment fund portfolios own PRC stocks listed on American exchanges, either directly or indirectly through emerging markets index funds. Now, how does that, you talk about draining the swamp. I mean, how are American universities, that is really an amazing statistic and information about the way they're using these universities, and they're tying in the universities almost as a way to lobby Congress on behalf of the Chinese government in some ways. I mean, and that's and also brings back the Confucius Institutes. Just comment on that. I'm
so index investing is really, a lot of these institutional investors have gone to index investing. It's almost like investing on autopilot. In the case that he's talking about, Morgan Stanley Capital International, which is one of the indexing companies, has an emerging markets index. Now, in 2018 they started adding China to their emerging markets index, and they went from 0 to 5 to 20% of that index in Chinese stocks. Now, why did they do that? Well, because the Chinese Communist Party put pressure on them and said if they wanted to continue to operate in China, they needed to add Chinese stocks to their portfolio. Again, this is in spite of the fact that they don't have audit and transparency requirements like other emerging market companies. And so we don't know what's going on. And in fact, many of those companies are just shams. And so the other thing that's going on, and this is both in institutional investors like retirement funds, but also university endowments, is this concept of alpha. Alpha, so if you're a chief investment officer at a university endowment, you get compensated based on alpha. And alpha is really your ability to earn a return above and beyond an index. So I just mentioned Morgan Stanley Capital International, but say that you have a group of stocks that does better than MSCI, then you're going to get compensated for that. It's very difficult for these companies, because of the transparency of our financial system, to do better in the U.S. market, because the S&P 500 is just really hard to beat because there's so much transparency in our market. These investors consider China to be in an immature market, and so they think they can generate higher returns and often do. So they generate more alpha in China, which means their compensation is higher. But what they don't understand is that the entire system is a Ponzi scheme. And so they're not really smarter investors, they haven't identified more value, because what they're investing is something that they don't actually understand the underlying financial metrics, because the Chinese companies don't have to report them. It's actually a national security violation. It's essentially treasonous if you disclose audit and transparency requirement in China. So that's why he's Undersecretary Kroc is talking about this, because it's a big problem. The SEC should have shut this down a long time ago. The Treasury should have shut this down a long time ago. When we think about helping our own society economically, financially, and certainly in national security, it is really discontinuing some of these bad things that are going on with the Chinese Communist Party, and that's one of the biggest.
General Spalding, is this? We've seen the recent. There was the arrest made by up at Harvard with the 10,000 Talents program, and now you see Secretary Kroc is making these statements. Are we now starting? Are the wheels in motion now by the U.S. government to try to crack down on these entities, along with the Confucius Institutes? I mean, obviously we're late to the ball game, but I mean, how long is it going to take before we kind of drain the swamp, so to speak, of all these index funds, the Confucius Institutes, and everything else that's permeated American universities?
So yes, I mean, we started really in the first quarter of 2018. What has to happen is that there has to be a virtuous cycle between the discovery of these things that are going on and then policy options that are meant to counter them. In our intelligence community, they're far more focused on kind of the military aspects of competition, not the economic, financial, and trade and informational aspects like TikTok, like MSCI. These have been the entire purview of our business community, who has been incentivized by the Chinese Communist Party to kind of continue to do some of these things. So as the administration has begun to identify the Chinese Communist Party as a strategic competitor, and as a lot of these things come to light, the intelligence community is not there to give policymakers the kind of information they need to create the policies that will protect us. What's happening, and if you look at the Wall Street Journal, is that the press is actually beginning to surface some of these things and write about them, and that enables then these policymakers to begin to fashion policies. So what we need is an intelligence community, and that's one of the things I think that's important about what Jamestown does, is to bring in this information for policymakers so they understand that the battlefield that the Chinese Communist Party chooses to fight on is not the one where you have bombs and bullets, but it's in ones and zeros and dollars and cents. We have to understand that. We have to understand the challenges that we face. The press has been doing an okay job of that. They could do better. But I mean, really, the intelligence community, which I consider the Jamestown Foundation to be a loose affiliation of, needs to do a better job of helping these policymakers understand the world that we live in.
And what you mean by Jamestown is that a provider of open source information to help promote analysis and understanding of these views.
Absolutely. We need, because what the Chinese Communist Party, their chief weapon is obfuscation, is the hiding of information, primarily through the Chinese language, which they consider to be their first level of encryption, and in not surfacing this information, and in the fact that national security professionals don't really know what Wall Street and corporate America are doing or understand, the challenges they face from China, then they're not there and available to make the kind of policy decisions that Undersecretary Kroc is talking about. The interagency exists to protect the American people and to provide the kind of environment that they can thrive. And as long as we're allowing this predatory behavior by the Chinese Communist Party, we're not fulfilling, in the government sense, we're not fulfilling our role to the American people.
Is that more of an interagency issue where that O'Brien should be chairing and overseeing this along with President Trump? How do you kind of, crack the whip, so to speak, on this process within the interagency to make it more focused and more coordinated in the ways that you're recommending?
Actually, the National Security Council is precisely that kind of organization, because it's supposed to raise these kinds of questions. And so it does that through its power to convene. So it convenes assistant secretaries at the interagency policy coordination meeting level. Then you have the deputies committee, and then you have the principals committee, and then you have the National Security Council. What we're trying to do is ask these questions at the National Security Council. And unfortunately, I think what I saw at the White House is that you have the National Security Council that does national security, and then you have the National Economic Council that does economics, and there's supposed to be a firewall between it. That's not good in a globalized internet connected world, because that firewall is how the Chinese Communist Party exists to exploit our economy for national security means.
Wow, I think you're totally spot on. That's a great kind of overview. Listen, we very much appreciate your time today. We will be posting this soon. We always appreciate your insights. Joining us is retired Brigadier General Robert Spalding, author of Stealth War, and he's working on a new book, and we're very excited about that. So, Rob, thank you very much for joining us today, and have a safe weekend.
Thank you.